Thank you very much. And this is my first time in South Africa, and I'm absolutely loving it. And my husband has already promised that he would take me to see the big animals, since I'm going to miss them this time. So I am going to talk about, I'm going to spend about half of my time talking about what we're actually seeing changing globally and with a focus on the oceans. But then the second half, I really want to get over to what we can do about these changes and how to mitigate or prevent the worst catastrophes from happening. So these are the actual temperature trends that we're seeing, and you notice there's a very, very strong latitudinal gradient, with the strongest warming being up in these boreal regions on the land, and that is because we're of largely very massive sea ice loss, which is changing the albedo quite dramatically up there, causing an intensification of the warming. So it's no big surprise then. I want to start by saying what groups of species are most being hurt by climate change, and it's no surprise that quite a few of those are sea ice dependent species. Everyone knows about the polar bear, but it isn't just the polar bear. It's really all the different species for which we have data, for which sea ice as habitat are declining dramatically in the Arctic. And I do want to point out that although you're not getting those huge temperature rises in the Antarctic, you are getting sea ice loss in both the Ross Sea, but particularly in the Palmer Peninsula. It's been very dramatic. And where you've had the most sea ice loss, you've had dramatic declines again of species dependent on sea ice. So the Adelie and emperor penguins feed by jumping off ice shelves. As those ice shelves have disappeared, their feeding grounds are basically not accessible to them, and they've been declining, particularly on the Palmer Peninsula, and you've had an invasion by more ocean-feeding species of penguin, like the gentoo and the chinstrap. So we're seeing changes in both polar regions, quite dramatic changes, and the other type of cold-adapted species that I want to briefly mention, I know they're not marine, but mountaintop species are also showing some of the strongest declines and even some of the first extinctions. The golden toad in Costa Rica, a cloud forest mountaintop species, has gone extinct, and it's very tightly linked with climatic changes. And the white lemur-eyed possum in Australia is again a cloud forest montane species, has not been seen for many, many years, even though intensive efforts have been made to find it. And then you've got very strong upward range contractions of a lot of butterflies and mammals, so they're becoming increasingly restricted to very tiny pieces of mountaintops. So these changes in distribution are one of the major types of change that we're seeing, but there are quite a few other changes that are much more, that people aren't as familiar with, and that are having just as dramatic consequences for species. One of these is the change in land temperature for many sea turtle species. In sea turtles, sex is determined by the temperature at which the egg is developing. Generally, hotter temperatures lead to females, cooler temperatures lead to males. People doing field surveys of not just the leatherback sea turtle, but other sea turtles as well, are estimating that they're now getting a fairly high proportion of 100% female populations. As yet, they're not seeing declines, but we know that at extreme heats, the embryos simply die. So we might be starting to see the first implication that sea turtles in general could be at very, very high risk. And indeed, they're being listed by most of the major conservation organizations as being a very high risk from climate change. Now I want to go back to these temperature trends, and the first thing you notice about this is it appears that the land is warming much more than the ocean. So you might think, okay, well, terrestrial species are being very strongly affected, and maybe the polar bear and the ring seal in the Arctic, but perhaps most of the ocean isn't really being affected because the change is so much less in the oceans than it is on land. But there's really a better way to look at these changes. Rather than looking at the absolute shift in temperature, think about looking at how much the temperature isotherms are shifting geographically. And when you do that, when you look at the velocity of climate change, the rate of change of that geographic shift in temperature isotherms, you see actually that that change is much greater in the oceans than it is on the land. So these dark orange areas are the areas of greatest velocity of climate change, and they're in the Arctic Ocean and along the equatorial regions. And so the implication of this is that oceanic species will need to move further in order to maintain their same climate space than would a terrestrial species. And indeed, that seems to be what we're seeing. So this is, by now, I guess it's considered an older study. It was done in the early 2000s using the plankton recorder data from the North Atlantic. And what Beaugrand et al. Showed was that you're not just getting individual species shifting, but you're really getting whole communities shifting more or less in concert. So you're getting effectively community replacement in various regions. So if you go over to the left, these southern species used to be very common just off the west coast of Europe, and now, 40 years later, they've migrated northward and they're quite common up in the North Sea. If you flip to the other extreme, these subarctic species used to be very common throughout the North Sea and the North Atlantic, and 40 years later, the only areas where they're at really high density is just off of Iceland. So these are huge shifts, 1,000-kilometer shifts in just a 40-year period. The other major type of change you're seeing is changes in phenology, changes in the timing of different events. And what this shows, it's a depiction of that shift in the temperature regimes. It's for April, so what it's showing is advancement of spring, these green colorations, advancement of spring in the northern hemisphere, and delay of fall in the southern hemisphere. And if you flip it around to the October, you get an even stronger effect, that you're getting very strong advancement of spring in the south and very strong delay of fall in the north. And again, I know it's a little difficult to see the land, but a lot of those very strong seasonal shifts are actually in ocean systems, not just on the land. And so I've been part of a working group in NCEAS, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. You can see how many times I've said that. And this NCEAS working group felt like we've done there are a lot of analyses or meta-analyses on a global scale that have largely terrestrial species in them. I'm not saying there weren't any marine species in, but not really commiserate with the biodiversity in ocean systems. So the idea of this working group was to really focus on marine systems. So this is a brand new analysis, literally hot out of the computer. And what's interesting to me is I put together some of those early meta-analyses, which were largely terrestrial. And what's interesting is we're seeing very, very similar changes in the ocean to what we're seeing on land. So people thought, well, maybe the oceans would be better buffered, maybe the oceans would be showing different types of change, but lo and behold, it's very, very analogous to what's happening on land. So in terms of phenological advancement, the dots pointing up are advancement of timing, and I think the red is spring and the yellow is summer. Sorry, it's brand new to me too, so I'm trying to remember what the colors were because we changed them so much. And in terms of range shift, species above this line are ones that are shifting their distribution into formerly cooler waters. And if we look at the magnitude of that advancement, we're seeing about 4 days per decade advancement in spring and about 4.4 days per decade advancement in summer. And this is a little bit higher in magnitude than what we're seeing in terrestrial systems, which is about 2.8 days per decade, but in the same order of magnitude, so not too different. But if you look at range shifts, there's actually quite a big difference. In marine systems, we're seeing a shift towards cooler waters. I don't want to even say poleward because it's more complicated than that, but shifts into historically cooler waters of 72 kilometers per decade. The comparable numbers for terrestrial systems are 20 kilometers decade from one study and even 6 kilometers decade from another. So when I was showing you that map of the velocity of climate change being much stronger in ocean systems, that is certainly being represented here with these much greater shifts on average for marine species than for terrestrial species. The other interesting thing to note, however, is that if you look at the extremes, the range of range shifts, it's actually very similar between terrestrial and marine systems. So the species that are shifting the most on land are shifting at about the same rate as the species shifting the most in the oceans. So we're getting 1,000 to 2,000 kilometer range shifts over the last 40 years or so. So the extremes are similar, but on average, oceanic species are shifting much further than our terrestrial species, which is exactly what you'd expect from the velocity of climate change. And if you look at which ones are shifting most, since I doubt that you can read these little letters there, I pointed out that the major shifts or the strongest shifts are in phytoplankton, zooplankton, and bony fish. And if you compare those results to what we're getting from other meta-analyses, most of these, so this is the marine one that I was just talking about. Most of these are largely terrestrial. I'd say, anywhere from 70 to 90% terrestrial. But what's interesting, so we've got lots of species now, and I want to say first off that there isn't that much overlap in the species data sets amongst these different studies. I think the most overlap was about 30%. So that we really are getting a lot of data on a lot of species now. And what's interesting is that if you look at the proportion of species that are showing change, so not all species are changing, right? Some of them are stable. If you look at the Rootedal data set, this was almost entirely terrestrial. 40% of species were showing a significant change, either in range, distribution, abundances, or phenologies. In the Parmesan and Yo data set, we had something like 20–30% marine species, 60% overall species are showing significant change over the last 40 to 100 years. And if you look at the entirely marine database, we're up to 76%. So it may be another suggestion that really more marine species are being affected, a higher proportion. But of course, it could also be that this is a more recent data set and we've had a decade of very, very hot temperatures. So the last thing I want to point out, if you focus on the species showing significant change and ask, is that change in the direction you'd expect from local or regional climate change, or is it opposite? You get this very, very, very strong consistency across all the studies. Anywhere from 80 to 90% of the observed significant changes are indeed exactly what you'd expect from local or regional climate change. So this is a very, very solid, this has led to a very solid, strong consensus amongst biologists that there's no question anthropogenic climate change is certainly affecting natural systems, and now we can say it's not just terrestrial systems, it's oceanic systems as well, in a very general sense, not just focusing on one group. And if you, another way of looking at that is if you can combine data from all those different studies, about half of species are changing where they live, about 2/3 of species are changing when they live, the timing of their events, and every major group for which we have data, so there are groups that we don't have data for, but if we've got good long time series observational data, every group, every taxonomic group is showing a substantial proportion of species responding to climate change. And impacts have now been seen on every continent and in every ocean. So it's a very pervasive signal. It's happening everywhere, no one is immune, which implies we need to do something about it. So how has this affected ecological science? I mean, what are the scientists doing? Are they doing anything differently now than they were a couple of decades ago? What I've done is I've put together symposium from the Ecological Society of America, big meeting, anywhere from 5,000 to 8,000 people every year. And the symposia give you a good idea of what people are what people are thinking is cutting edge in the field, in the science of ecology. And you can see back in 1990, really the bulk of the symposia were on some sort of basic ecological science, or empirical studies, hardcore experimental studies, and theory. And just a little bit, of conservation, a little bit of, people saying, where should ecology be going, but not a whole lot. Just a decade later, suddenly you're getting this great rise in people working directly on conservation and applied issues. And I strongly feel that the reason for that is people were starting to see they were doing basic ecology in some field system that they'd been working on for 10, 20, 30 years, and they were starting to see it being degraded, being altered by anthropogenic activities. And so people started becoming more concerned about, shifting from basic science into doing something to help save their ecosystems. And this led to quite a lot of the symposia in 2000 where, what should we be doing as ecologists? Look what's happening. We're seeing our systems destroyed. We're not going to have anything to study in another 20 years. What should we do about it? How should science be affecting this process? And what research should we be focusing on? So that was just an amazing proportion of talks were on that topic. And then by 2010, people decided what we should be doing, right? So we're not really going on and on about, oh, help, what should ecologists be doing? And a lot of resources have been shifted out of basic ecology into more applied conservation, but also a huge increase in this category, which is, and by policy relevant, I mean people doing real ecological science, hardcore science, but doing it in a way that it's immediately applicable to decision-making and policymakers. And that's a very new shift for the ecological community to be making. And finally, the emergence of this whole new group that I call sort of public education and citizen science. And I think the reason for that is that just getting scientists to put more of their effort into conservation and applied ecology isn't enough. We've got to get the public on board to understand what's happening in order to affect policy decisions. And also, we need more data. And we don't have enough scientists to gather the amount of data that we need in order to address some of the questions that we're coming up with now. So the citizen science is partly selfish. It's not just altruistic. It's, hey, if you're excited about this, let's use your labor and get some use out of it. And one reason we need more data is, although I mentioned we've now got several thousand species for which we have long-term time series and can look at what the changes have been and relate it to climate change or not, that data is very biased in where it comes from. So here's from the marine data set. You can see that there's a high density of data from Northern Europe, East Coast North America, off California basically, and some off Australia, but these vast areas where we really have no data, and there's no way that and very similar in the terrestrial system as well, actually almost an identical map, except just move over onto the land, and you've got the same, basically the same pattern in terrestrial systems. And I really believe that the only way we're going to fill out that map is to get citizen science and get citizens involved in collecting the data, hopefully find some amateur naturalists that have been looking at the limpets on their coast for 60 years and get really excited that someone might actually want all this information. And certainly in terrestrial systems, we've been finding quite a lot of that. Butterfly collectors, dragonfly collectors, who just have an enormous amount of high-quality data, but you have to find them. And I'm convinced you've got the same thing in marine systems as well. So we need citizen science in order to, public citizens, in order to advance our own science. Okay, so where are we going? What about the conservation implications of all these changes? Well, this is a projection map. This is where we are now. This is the temperature rise we've had so far. This is where we're likely to go over the next 100 years. But what I want to point out in terms of what we should do about it is that this red line is the business as usual scenario. And this scenario was made up in the 1990s. Now, we have already exceeded the level of emissions that people thought was business as usual back in the 1990s. So we're, if you look at the projections, these are not going to happen. I mean, these are definitely the most likely at this point. And so in terms of conservation, absolutely the most important thing to do is to lower the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. There's no question about that. But since I've been involved in these things like IPCC and the COP meetings, these big international meetings, for 15 years, there's lots of talk and there's even lots of enthusiasm. But if you look at the action, I think this graph tells you, and the statement I just made, that we've already exceeded business as usual, tells you nothing's really been done. So as conservation biologists, then what can we do? Given that we're not getting policymakers to take action, what can we do? Well, I think one of the first things we can recognize is that we may not be able to reduce outgoing emissions, but perhaps we can increase the amount of sink that we have, the carbon uptake in our ecosystems. And people always talk about tropical forest and trees, and that's great. And tropical forests, they do hold a lot of carbon. But it turns out that some native oceanic systems actually hold more carbon in storage than do the iconic tropical forest. And these systems are only just now being recognized for their utility as carbon storage vehicles. So, one, we need to stop destroying them because about 1/6 of CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions are from forest degradation and destruction. So they're from us destroying ecosystems. But also we need to think about restoring coastal ecosystems, mangroves, seagrasses, etc., that are so very good at carbon uptake to start increasing the level of that sink. So that's solution number one. Now that involves a lot of restoration. But in a time of rapid climate change, you need to also think carefully about what you mean by restoration. Historically, restoration meant that you're recreating the historic state for that system. So you have a reference system that sometime in the past you're trying to recreate it. But with the changing climate, they may not be appropriate. And here's, I think, a very good example of this. This is in the desert Southwest in the USA. A single hot, dry summer stressed out trees enormously. A huge beetle invasion came out. Thousands and thousands of acres of trees died. This was the pinyon pine, and this is what it looked like a few years later, just very, very little recovery. That land needs to be restored because if they don't put something, they're going to get massive soil erosion, and that'll cause human health problems and problems with livestock and everything else. So they have the motivation to do a restoration project. But I'd argue if a single hot, dry summer caused this massive a die-off, and the desert Southwest USA is one of the few places where climate models are largely in agreement that it's going to get a lot hotter and a lot drier. Do you really want to take the traditional approach to restoration and put back pinyon pine? I think not. I think you want to be thinking of what other type of ecosystem or community, plant community, might be able to grow in the kind of climate conditions that you're going to be getting in the future. And very minimally, you at least want to take genotypes that survived that massive drought. If you don't really want to move in new species, you at least want to be very, very careful to pick genotypes that are appropriate for a future climate rather than a current or rather than a past climate. So the other problem with traditional restoration is it assumes that species have an evolutionary history of a whole range of climates that have occurred in that general region. But if you look at this analysis of the future, this is looking at change over the next 100 years, and the A2 scenario is the business as usual. So I'd say look at the left side rather than the right side, because the right side's just not going to happen. So we're seeing massive change in an absolute sense, and I'm sorry the oceans weren't included in this study. But even more so, what Williams et al. Did is they looked at 4 different climate variables, mean summer precip, mean winter precip, mean summer temperature, mean winter temperature, and created a climate space from that. And what they found is a lot of areas actually are producing novel combinations of those 4 variables. And that's novel for the globe, not novel locally. And at the same time, a lot of climate spaces are disappearing completely from the globe. No big surprise, some of these are in the very high mountains. So in terms of traditional restoration, you're talking about trying to come up with a community in a space that hasn't had that climate, at least not for a very, very, very long time, so that the species you're trying to put in there very likely don't have an evolutionary history of that climate space. So I'd argue that we need to think beyond restoration to habitat creation. Do I think we have the science to do this now? No, we don't. But I think this is where our research dollars should be going. This is where our effort should be going, is how can we accurately project what different species will do, putting them in combinations that they've never been in before. And in doing this, you can also think of trying to maximize carbon sequestration by those new systems. Now, that was looking at shifts in climate space in an absolute sense at a global scale. But species don't live at a global scale. Humans are the only species that live across the globe. Most species live in really relatively small areas, the size of one country or even part of a country. And if you think then about species trying to move around within the areas that they can disperse to, then they're seeing much greater shifts than we expect if you're looking at a global scale. So given within a 500-kilometer area, you suddenly get a huge amount of the Earth, almost half of the terrestrial land, showing a novel climate within that 500-kilometer area. And again, huge swathes of land showing disappearing climates. This means that even if the climate space for a species still exists somewhere, it's not very likely that that species will be able to disperse to that new place to create a new colony. Therefore, it behooves people, conservation biologists, to think about assisting species in moving around the planet. And this is often called assisted colonization or assisted migration or assisted translocation. And it's something that a lot of conservation biologists are very nervous about because they've been spending decades fighting invasive species, and here some of us are coming out saying, bring in exotic species into places where they have never historically occurred, and it'll all be okay. So yes, we need to do this very carefully, but it's really a risk-benefit trade-off. If you've got a huge proportion of the biodiversity at very high risk from climate change, which I'd argue we certainly have that in some ecosystems, in the most cold-adapted ecosystems already, and we're going to start getting that in more systems, then they're going to go extinct anyway. You may as well try something. And do it carefully, don't do it willy-nilly. So we came up with a framework for how you would do this, and this is kind of a list of the kind of species that would be a good candidate for assisted colonization. You don't want to move big predators, parasites. You want them to be relatively poor competitors and non-aggressive. They need to be easy and cheap to capture, culture, and move. So you get down to a limited set of species, but I do think we need to start thinking that as being part of the conservation toolbox, not in and of itself, but added to the list of things, of actions that we can actually take to do something about climate change. And finally, what about traditional conservation? Well, it's turning out that we need to keep that going too. We need to not abandon traditional conservation. And here's a really nice example of why that's so important. So I'm sure all of you know coral reefs have been disappearing due to high SST. Something like 30% are gone due to multiple extreme SST events. And IUCN states that some 48% of reef-building corals are at high risk from climate change and rising greenhouse gases. But some new experiments, and this is done on the Great Barrier Reef, indicate that recovery from bleaching is very, very dependent on the state of the system. So this is an area in the Great Barrier Reef, huge area bleached. It's a very healthy ecosystem. It has a very good abundance and diversity of fish. That didn't affect its bleaching, but what they did is they ran out after the bleaching event and they put up these exclosures in which they took out all the fish. So they mimicked overfishing in an area that actually is a very healthy ecosystem and is not fished at all. And a few years later, what they found is, actually very quickly, the areas where they removed all the fish had enormous algal blooms that ended up covering everything. And the areas that they just left alone, which had the healthy ecosystem, after 5 years, were starting to recover quite nicely. And if you look at the data from that study, this is showing you that the percent of algal cover was very, very high in the mimicking of overfishing, and the percent of algal cover stayed really low where you had fish, a healthy fish diversity in the system. The increase in coral cover was not bad, some 80 to 60% increase in areas with a good biodiversity, healthy ecosystem, and was about 20 to 30% in areas that were overfished. And then if you look at recruits, many, many more recruits, almost double the number of recruits in areas with a healthy biodiversity compared to areas that were mimicked to be overfished. And again, the percent of live after a few years was much, much higher in the healthy area and really low, quite a bit lower in the areas that were overfished. So the message from this is, all right, we can't do anything about the bleaching, probably. But the thing is, if you can keep the system healthy, it has greater resilience. So you can't necessarily affect an instantaneous impact of an extreme event, but you can help that system recover by keeping it healthy, and keeping it healthy by all the traditional toolboxes we've got in conservation. So we don't know what impact this would have had. We probably still would have lost some reefs, but we would have lost less. And that's a very, very important message. And I think a very important message to get across to applied conservation managers, that what they've been doing all these decades is still very important. It's not useless in a time of climate change. So this is just a summary of what I've been talking about, that we need to be very active and proactive in trying to combat the effects of climate change, that we can think about carbon sequestration as a positive thing, that this is a real motivator for getting ecosystems restored, because they do store much more carbon than degraded ecosystems or exploited ecosystems. So now we have a financial motivation for restoring these areas. That restoration, we need to think beyond just traditional restoration to more proactive restoration that thinks about where this system is going climatically over the next 100 years or so. And I should say another reason for restoring these habitats is that we're getting rising sea level, which means increased storm surge, and yet we have more and more people living in coastal areas than ever before. And there's a good argument can be made that a lot of these systems, seagrass and mangrove and oyster reef systems, will help those coastal communities be buffered against that storm surge. Finally, assisted colonization has a lot of forms. You can think of it very passively as just creating habitat structure to help species move on their own, such as putting out concrete blocks to help corals move. You can think of it as being very active, where you pick things up and move them, but that could be moving genotypes of the same species, as well as moving species from one point to another point outside their historic range. And these types of assisted colonization are already being done. In the Great Barrier Reef, they're moving both genotypes, getting hot adapted genotypes into new areas, as well as moving species around. And it seems to be very successful. In terrestrial systems, they've been moving fish from from central England up into northern England to try to help them cope with rising lake temperatures, and people are starting to move around butterflies and trees as well. So this is already being done, and so far it's been pretty successful. And finally, we need to maintain traditional conservation efforts, and that includes marine protected areas. Marine protected areas, I'm one of the people who thinks they are a great benefit, but they need to be bigger and better connected to cope with a shifting climate. So what does this mean for aquariums? I think aquariums have a lot of roles to play, and this is only touching on some of them. If you think about all the things I talked about, the solutions for dealing with climate change, the types of things aquariums do slot in beautifully with a lot of those. So culturing. if you're going to talk about assisted colonization, we need to have bodies to move. And generally, if you're dealing with species that are already endangered, you don't want to be moving them from a natural population. You want to get them into culture, bump their numbers up, and then transplant those into new areas. Because you might have a very high risk of the whole population going extinct, at least in the first few years. So culturing is going to become increasingly important for these sorts of movements of species around the globe. And there's another viewpoint, which I think is a little depressing to think about, but a lot of the people doing seed banking, terrestrial seed banking, consider that we're not going to stop global change and climate change in time. We are going to lose a huge amount of biodiversity. Then humans will act and greenhouse gas emissions will go down. And as we start getting a more historic state of the climate, we're going to need a source of seeds in order to restore those ecosystems. So they're thinking very, very long term of restoring ecosystems that they do believe will go extinct. I think that's a little depressing to think about that, but again, cultures become very, very important. Banking of biodiversity becomes very important. In terms of the science, we need a much, much better understanding of habitat creation, both traditional restoration, wire restoration efforts, either successes or failures, but also we need to start doing experiments with putting species together into novel combinations and see if we can't come up with a predictive framework for when that will work and when it won't. And coordinating citizen science in many, many, many ways. Getting citizens excited about this work so that they collect data and give it to us, hopefully. And again, a lot of the restoration projects require a huge amount of labor, which we don't have and we can't afford to pay for. And when I give this talk to groups of just concerned citizens, they're very willing to help. They just need someone to coordinate them. They want to do something. They don't mind doing it for free. They're excited about it, but they need someone to coordinate them. And I think aquariums can have a very powerful role in that kind of coordination. And finally, communication and outreach and education. I can't emphasize enough that, again, I've been involved with these sort of high-level international policy efforts for some 15 years, and wonderful talks, wonderful meetings, but really when it comes down to it, we're not seeing the action. Greenhouse gases are continuing to rise, the rate of rise is increasing, and I do believe that the only way that the global and national policymakers are going to take real action, rather than just talking about it, is a grassroots effort. And that's going to come from individual citizens understanding what's happening and going to their local politician and saying, why aren't you doing something about this? I want you to do something about this. And that only comes through education and outreach. There's just no other way of getting the public engaged in that way, and that's something aquariums do so very well. And also data. We do need data, and some citizen data is not very good and not very usable. But again, if it's well coordinated by a central body, and people are given very strict outlines for what to gather, it can be fantastic. And that's one reason the United Kingdom has such fantastic databases, is they've got a very well coordinated system, lots of volunteers, and a very centralized unit that makes sure that everyone's doing things in a standard way. So that's the end of my talk, and I hope that I've managed to be more positive than depressing.